married her on a Tuesday in a church half empty by his own design. And he did it to make the whole of London gasp. The Earl of Hawksmoor had calculated the wedding the way he calculated everything since his sister died. Coldly, precisely, with an eye to the exact wound it would inflict on the people he intended to wound. He had chosen the church for its prominence, and the hour for its inconvenience, and the guest list for its pointed exclusions. And above all, he had chosen the bride, because the bride was the whole of the insult, and the insult was the whole of the point. Miss Charlotte Reeve was a governess. Worse than a governess, a ruined governess. A woman dismissed from her post without a character, her name spoken in the drawing rooms of Mayfair only as a cautionary example. A woman the ton had collectively decided was beneath its notice and beyond its mercy. She was precisely the kind of woman that the society Hawksmoor despised would cross a street to avoid, would cut at a ball, would refuse to receive under any circumstances whatsoever. And he was making her a countess. That was the insult. That was the calculated, deliberate, exquisite cruelty of it. Not to the bride, though he gave little thought that March to what it might be to the bride, but to the ton. He was taking a woman they had cast out, exactly as they cast out everyone they decided to destroy. And he was elevating her above them all, and he was forcing them to receive her, to curtsy to her, to call her my lady, because she would be the Countess of Hawksmoor, and the Earl of Hawksmoor's Countess could not be cut, could not be refused, could not be treated as the ton treated the women it ruined, however much the ton might wish to. They had destroyed his sister for less than a rumour. Now they would bow to a woman they would have spat upon. That was the architecture of his revenge, and he had built it carefully. And on the Tuesday in March, he completed it, in the half-empty church, beside a bride he had selected as one selects a weapon, for its capacity to wound, rather than for anything it was in itself. He did not look at her during the ceremony. He noticed, distantly, that she did not weep, which most of the desperate women his solicitor had identified as candidates would have done, from gratitude or fear, or the simple overwhelm of a ruined woman finding herself, against all expectation, married to an earl. She did not weep, and she did not tremble, and she did not cling. She stood beside him at the altar, with a composure he registered without quite attending to, and she spoke her vows in a clear, even voice. And when the ceremony was complete, she looked at him, directly, with a quality of assessment he was not expecting, and did not, at the time, examine. And she said the first words she had spoken to him that were not part of the ceremony. She told him, "You have not once looked at me. I wonder whether you know the colour of your wife's eyes." He did not know the colour of her eyes. He found, to his irritation, that he looked then, and that they were grey, a clear and direct grey, and that they were looking at him with an expression that was not gratitude, and was not fear, and was not any of the things a ruined woman's eyes were supposed to hold when an earl had lifted her out of disgrace. It was amusement, cold, intelligent, entirely unintimidated amusement. He had married a weapon, and the weapon was looking at him as though he were the one who had just been acquired, for a purpose he did not yet understand. He told her, "It does not signify." She told him, "No, I don't suppose to you it does." She inclined her head, a precise, courteous, faintly ironic inclination. She told him, "Shall we go and horrify your enemies, my lord? I find I am rather looking forward to it. It is not every day a ruined woman is handed a sword." The Earl of Hawksmoor looked at his new wife in the half-empty church, and felt, for the first time since he had conceived of his revenge, the specific unease of a man who has picked up a tool and discovered it has opinions. If you are new to Moonlight at Mayfair, stay for this one. A cold earl who married a ruined woman to wound his enemies, and a bride who turns out to be a great deal more than the weapon he thought he was acquiring. Subscribe before we go on, because watching this man's cynicism collapse is the entire pleasure of this story. And if you have been here before, you already know. He thinks he has married a pawn. He has married his match. Watch what she does to him. To understand the Earl of Hawksmoor's coldness, you have to understand Lady Lydia. And to understand Lady Lydia, you have to understand what the Ton does to a woman it has decided to destroy. Lydia had been his younger sister, and she had been, by every account, including the cold Earl's own, the warmest person either of them had ever known. Bright and generous, and trusting in the specific way of a young woman who has not yet been given a reason to be otherwise. She had come out at 18 into a London that adored her, and she had been, for one glittering season, the toast of the very society that would later destroy her. And she had made the single error that the Ton never forgave, which was to trust the wrong man. He had been charming and well-connected, and entirely without honor. And he had courted her with the practiced ease of a man who collected such conquests. And when the courtship had produced a private indiscretion, a single one, a foolish and innocent one, the kind of thing that a gentleman of honor would have answered with a proposal, he had not answered it with a proposal. He had answered it by talking, by letting the story circulate in the careful, deniable way such stories circulated, until the Ton that had adored Lydia turned on her with the specific relish it reserved for the fall of someone it had recently exalted. They destroyed her. Not the man. The man suffered nothing, because the Ton did not destroy men for such things. It destroyed women. They cut her at every occasion. They struck her from every list. They turned the warmth she had given so freely into the instrument of her ruin. And they did it with the smiling, deniable cruelty that was the Ton's particular art. Never an open word, always a turned shoulder, a lowered fan, a conversation that stopped when she entered a room. The family standing could not survive it. Their father, weak and proud, had withdrawn them from society in shame rather than fight for his daughter, had treated Lydia's ruin as her failure rather than the Ton's cruelty. And Lydia had been sent away, to a cottage in the country, in the exile that the Ton prescribed for the women it cast out. She had died there. Not dramatically. The Ton would have enjoyed a dramatic death, would have found it a fitting end to a cautionary tale. She had died of a fever, in the second winter of her exile, in cold lodgings that the family's withdrawn circumstances could not adequately heat, attended by no one but a single loyal servant and her brother, who had ridden through the night to reach her and had arrived in time only to watch her go. She had been 20. The Earl of Hawksmoor, he had been plain Mr. Adrian Vane then, the title still his father's, had held his sister's hand in the cold cottage as the fever took her. And he had made, in the holding, the specific cold vow of a man whose grief has nowhere to go but into purpose. He had vowed that the society that had destroyed her would answer for it. Not the man. The man was beyond his reach, having had the convenience to die in a duel over a different woman 2 years later. The society. The smiling, fan-lowering, shoulder-turning society that had taken his warm and trusting sister and destroyed her for a single, foolish trust, and had felt, in the destroying, not a moment's shame. He had inherited the title and the fortune 3 years later, when his father died, and with the title and the fortune had come the power to make the vow real. And he had spent 2 years deciding exactly how to make it real, how to strike the ton in the place it would feel most, how to throw its cruelty back in its smiling face. And he had arrived at the marriage. He would take a woman the ton had ruined, a woman cast out exactly as Lydia had been cast out, a woman the ton had decided was beneath its notice, and he would make her a countess, and he would force the society that had destroyed his sister to bow to the very kind of woman it had destroyed her for being. It was perfect. It was exact. It was the cruelty of the ton turned precisely back upon itself. He had instructed his solicitor to find him a suitable bride, a woman sufficiently ruined to make the insult sharp, sufficiently desperate to accept the arrangement, sufficiently presentable to carry the title. The solicitor had brought him Miss Charlotte Reeve. He had not, in his careful architecture of revenge, given a single thought to who Miss Charlotte Reeve actually was. That was his error. It would prove to be the most significant error of his life, and the most fortunate. She had been ruined for refusing to lie. This was the thing the Earl did not know on the Tuesday in March, because he had not asked, because she had been a weapon to him, and one did not inquire into the inner life of a weapon. But it was the truth of Charlotte Reeve, and it was the reason she stood at the altar, with cold amusement in her grey eyes, instead of gratitude. Because a woman who has been ruined for refusing to lie is a woman who has already discovered exactly how much the world's opinion is worth, and the discovery makes her very difficult to intimidate. She had been governess in the household of a baronet, a respectable post, secured by her education, which was considerable, and her references, which had been excellent. She had been good at the work. She had taught the baronet's 3 daughters with the specific intellectual seriousness that she brought to everything, and she had been, for 2 years, exactly what a governess was supposed to be: invisible, competent, and beyond reproach. And then the baronet's son had come home from Oxford. He had been 22 and accustomed to taking what he wanted, and what he had decided he wanted was the governess, and he had pursued her with the casual confidence of a young man who had never been refused anything in his life. She had refused him. She had refused him clearly, repeatedly, and finally with a sharpness that had wounded his pride more than the refusal itself. Because Charlotte Reeve, when sufficiently provoked, had a tongue like a blade, and she had used it on the baronet's son when he had cornered her in the library one time too many, and she had reduced him, in 30 seconds of precise and devastating words, to the specific, furious humiliation of a man who has been seen clearly and found wanting. He had gone to his mother, and he had told her, because a man whose pride has been wounded will say anything to repair it, that the governess had pursued him, had thrown herself at him, had been brazen and grasping, and entirely without shame. And the baronet's wife, who had a son to protect and a governess who was expendable, had chosen to believe the convenient lie. Charlotte had been given a choice. She could go quietly, accept the dismissal, accept the loss of her character, accept the ruin, and leave without a word. Or she could make difficulties. The baronet's wife had made the choice sound generous. Go quietly, and perhaps in time the matter would be forgotten. Make difficulties, and the family would ensure that her ruin was complete and permanent. Charlotte had not gone quietly. She had told the truth. She had told it to the baronet's wife, plainly and completely, what the son had actually done, how many times, in what words, and exactly what kind of young man the wife was choosing to protect at the cost of an innocent woman's livelihood. And then, when the wife had refused to hear it, she had told it to anyone who would listen. Because Charlotte Reeve had decided, somewhere in the cornering and the refusing and the lying, that she would rather be ruined for the truth than saved by a silence that let a guilty man go free, and called her the guilty one. The family had been as good as their threat. A governess who went quietly might be forgotten. A governess who told the truth about a gentleman's son was a danger that had to be destroyed completely. They had ensured her ruin was total. No character, no post, no possibility of employment. Her name a byword for exactly the brazen, grasping behavior the son had invented. She had spent 8 months in a boarding house in a declining street, watching her small savings dwindle, refused at every door she knocked on, ruined as thoroughly as the ton knew how to ruin a woman. And then, a solicitor had arrived with the most extraordinary proposal she had ever received, that the Earl of Hawksmoor wished to marry her. She had understood the proposal completely the moment the solicitor explained it. She had understood that she was not being offered rescue, but employment of a peculiar kind. That the Earl wished to use her, exactly as the baronet's son had wished to use her, exactly as the world used women it considered expendable. The only difference was that the Earl was offering a title instead of a ruin, and the use he intended was not seduction, but revenge. She had thought about refusing. She had thought about it for an entire night, in the cold boarding house room, with her savings nearly gone and no door in London open to her. And she had decided to accept. But not for the reason the Earl assumed. Not from desperation, though she was desperate, and not from gratitude, which she did not feel. She had accepted because she had seen, in the Earl's proposal, a particular irony that appealed to the same quality in her that had refused to go quietly. She was being offered a sword. The world had ruined her and expected her to disappear, and instead, she was going to walk back into its drawing rooms as a countess, and curtsy, and watch the people who had cast her out be forced to curtsy back. She had accepted the Earl's revenge because it happened to align, in that one respect, with the revenge of her own. But she had no intention of being a weapon. She had been used by men who saw her as an instrument, and she had been ruined for refusing it. And she was not now going to become, willingly, the exact thing she had been ruined for refusing to be. She would be the Earl's countess. She would horrify his enemies for him, gladly, because horrifying them suited her purposes as well as his. But she would be a person while she did it. And if the Earl of Hawksmoor thought he had acquired a weapon, he was going to discover, slowly, and to his considerable discomfort, that he had acquired a wife, and that a wife with a mind like a blade was a great deal harder to keep in a drawer than he had anticipated. The first weeks of the marriage were a war conducted in silence and at the dinner table. The Earl had intended to ignore his bride. This had been part of the architecture. She was a weapon, and one did not converse with a weapon. One simply deployed it. He would present her to society as the Countess of Hawksmoor, force the ton to receive her, and otherwise leave her to occupy whatever corner of his vast and cold house she chose, while he went about the business of his life as though he had not married at all. He found this plan impossible to execute, because Charlotte Reeve would not be ignored. She would not be ignored, not through any campaign of demanding his attention. She demanded nothing, which was itself disconcerting, but through the simple, persistent fact of being interesting. They dined together, because even the coldest marriage observed the form of dining together. And at the dinner table, across the length of the polished mahogany, the Earl discovered that his weapon had read more widely than he had, thought more sharply than he did, and possessed a perspective on nearly everything that was unconventional, well-reasoned, and entirely her own. He had not wanted to engage with her. He had wanted to eat in cold silence and retreat to his study. But she would say something, about a book, about a matter of politics, about some piece of news, that was so precisely observed, so unexpectedly intelligent, but he found himself answering before he had decided to, And the answering became a conversation, and the conversation became, against every intention he had, the thing he found himself looking forward to. She did not flatter him. This was the first thing that disarmed him. He was an earl, rich and powerful, and he was accustomed to being agreed with, and Charlotte Reeve disagreed with him constantly, not from contrariness, but because she had actually thought about the matters they discussed, and had arrived at conclusions, and her conclusions were frequently different from his, and frequently better. She told him when he was wrong. She told him precisely how he was wrong, with the specific, devastating clarity that had reduced a baronet's son to fury and had, the Earl was beginning to discover, an entirely different effect on a man who valued his mind more than his pride. She told him, in the second week, that his analysis of the Corn Law debates was sentimental. He had not been called sentimental in his life. He was the coldest man in London. Sentiment was the one charge no one had ever thought to lay against him. He asked her, with some asperity, what she meant. She told him, "You argue against the landed interest because you despise the men who hold it, not because you have examined the economics. You have let your contempt for a class do your thinking for you, which is sentiment dressed as principle. The landed interest is wrong, but it is wrong for reasons you have not troubled to understand, because understanding them would require you to reason rather than to hate, and you have grown so accustomed to hating that you have forgotten how to do anything else." The Earl of Hawksmoor sat at the head of his cold table and looked at his ruined bride. No one had spoken to him like that since Lydia died. No one had dared. He had built a wall of cold contempt around himself after his sister's death, and the wall had worked exactly as walls work. It had kept everyone out, and it had kept him in, and he had not noticed, in 3 years, how completely it had narrowed him. Until a governess he had married as a weapon told him across the dinner table that his principles had curdled into hatred, and his reasoning had atrophied for lack of use. He should have been angry. He waited to be angry. He found, instead, that he was interested, and that the interest was the first thing he had felt, other than cold purpose, in 3 years. He told her, "You are very free with your opinions for a woman in your position." She told him, "I have no position, my lord. You ruined what remained of it by marrying me, and the ton ruined the rest before you. A woman with nothing left to lose is the freest creature in England." She looked at him across the table. She told him, "It is rather the only advantage of ruin, and I intend to enjoy it." The pivotal moment came at the Aldermere ball, which was the first significant occasion at which the Earl presented his new Countess to the society he intended to horrify. It went exactly as he had designed it. The ton, forced to receive the Countess of Hawksmoor, received her, could not do otherwise, an earl's wife being beyond the reach of the cut and the turned shoulder, and received her with the specific, suppressed horror of a society confronted with a woman it had ruined, now standing among them with a coronet's worth of precedence. He watched their discomfort with the cold satisfaction of a man whose weapon was performing exactly as intended. The whispers moved through the ballroom. The fans lowered. The same smiling cruelty that had destroyed Lydia turned its attention to Charlotte, and could do nothing, because Charlotte was a countess now, and beyond its power. He was enjoying it. And then a man named Lord Faversham, an older man, malicious and well-connected, one of the architects of the smiling cruelty the Earl despised, made his remark. He made it loudly enough to be heard, in the carrying tone of a man performing for an audience, and he made it about the Earl rather than about Charlotte, which was the calculated cleverness of it. He observed, to the cluster around him but pitched for the room, that it was a curious thing for a man to marry so far beneath himself, and that he had heard the late Lady Lydia's brother had always been peculiar. and that perhaps the peculiarity ran in the family. Perhaps, he suggested, with the specific poison of a man invoking a destroyed woman to wound her brother. The whole family had simply never quite known how to conduct itself. The cluster laughed. The room listened. The Earl of Hawksmoor went very still, in the specific way of a man who has been struck in the one place he cannot defend, because his sister was the one subject in the world against which his cold armour did not hold. And Faversham knew it, and had aimed for it precisely. Before the Earl could answer, before he could decide whether to answer, whether there was any answer that would not make the wound worse, his wife answered for him. Charlotte Reeve, Countess of Hawksmoor, turned to Lord Faversham, and she did to him, in the middle of the Aldermere ballroom, what she had once done to a baronet's son in a library. She took him apart, precisely, with words, in a manner that left him nothing to stand on. She told him, in a voice that was perfectly level, and that carried, in the way that perfectly level voices carried in rooms that had gone quiet to listen, that she found it interesting that Lord Faversham should raise the subject of how a family conducts itself. She told him she had heard a great deal in her time about how the ton conducted itself, about its smiling cruelties and its turned shoulders, about its particular genius for destroying the women it could not possess and the families it could not control, about the way it dressed its viciousness in manners and called the result good breeding. She told him that the late Lady Lydia had been destroyed by exactly that conduct, by men like Lord Faversham, who could not seduce a warm and trusting girl, and so contented themselves with helping to ruin her, and who now, years later, invoked her name at a ball to wound her brother, because cruelty to the dead was the only kind of courage such men possessed. She told him, "You ask how a family conducts itself, my lord. I should think the more interesting question is how a society conducts itself. A society that destroyed an innocent girl for a single trust and feels no shame, and that mocks her grieving brother at a ball, and that imagines, in its smiling viciousness, that it occupies any position from which it might judge the conduct of others." She let the silence hold. She told him, "I was ruined by this society before I married into it, my lord. I know precisely what it is, and I find that being a countess has not improved my opinion of it in the slightest. It has merely improved my view." The Aldermere ballroom was entirely silent. Lord Faversham, who had invoked a dead girl to wound her brother, and had been answered by a countess who had just described, accurately and devastatingly, and in front of the whole of London, exactly what the ton was. Lord Faversham had nothing to say, because there was nothing to say, because every word had been true, and the room knew it was true, and the truth, spoken aloud in a ballroom by a woman the society had ruined, was the one weapon against which the smiling cruelty had no defence. He withdrew. The cluster around him dispersed, and the Earl of Hawksmoor stood in the silent ballroom and looked at his wife, who had just defended his sister, defended Lydia, whom she had never met, whose memory she had no reason to care about, who was nothing to her but a name in the architecture of a marriage of spite, and had defended her better, more fiercely, more truly, than the Earl himself had ever managed in 3 years of cold and silent rage. She had not done it for him. He understood that, even in the moment. She had done it because Faversham had been cruel, and she despised cruelty, and because the ton had ruined her too, and because Charlotte Reeve, when she saw a viciousness she could answer, answered it. She had not done it as a wife defending a husband. She had done it as a person who could not let a cruelty pass. But she had defended Lydia. And the Earl of Hawksmoor, who had married her as a weapon and had spent 3 years unable to feel anything but cold purpose, felt the wall he had built around himself develop in that silent ballroom, its first genuine crack. After the ball, the library became the place where the marriage changed. The Earl of Hawksmoor had a great library, 3 generations of accumulated books, which he had read more of than most men, but less of than he pretended, and which Charlotte, deprived of every other occupation by her position as a countess, who was received but not welcomed, had begun to work through with the systematic hunger of a woman who had spent her life educating others and had finally been given the leisure to educate herself. He found her there in the evenings. At first, he found her there by accident and retreated. Then he found her there and stayed, on the pretext of selecting a book of his own. And then he stopped pretending and simply came to the library in the evenings because she was in the library in the evenings, and the conversations that happened in the library were the best conversations of his life. They talked about everything. They talked about the books she was reading and the books he had read, about philosophy and politics and history, about the nature of justice and the conduct of society, and the question, which neither of them quite raised directly, but which underlay everything, of what it meant to be wronged and what one owed in return. They disagreed constantly and productively. She sharpened him. He had grown dull in his 3 years of cold purpose, in the way that a mind grows dull when it is used only to hate. And Charlotte's mind, which had been honed to a blade by a life of having to think faster and more clearly than the people who held power over her, sharpened his back into something that could reason again. He began to look forward to the evenings the way he had once looked forward to nothing. And somewhere in the library evenings, the cold purpose that had organized his life for 3 years began to feel, for the first time, hollow. This was the thing he did not expect, and could not, at first, account for. His revenge was succeeding. He had married his weapon and deployed it, and the Tun was horrified. And his countess had even, at the Aldermere ball, struck a blow against the society he despised, more devastating than any he had managed himself. By every measure he had set himself 3 years ago in the cold cottage where Lydia died, he was winning. And the winning felt like nothing. He examined this, in the way that Charlotte had taught him to examine things, by reasoning rather than by hating. And he arrived, slowly, over the library evenings, at an understanding that disturbed him profoundly. That his revenge had given him no peace, because his revenge had never been the point. The point had been Lydia. The point had been a warm and trusting girl, destroyed by a vicious society. And the grief of it, and the rage of it, and the need to make the viciousness answer. And the revenge, the marriage, the weapon, the horror of the Tun, had never touched any of that, because you could not avenge a warm and generous person by becoming a cold and calculating one. You could only become, in the avenging, the opposite of the person you were avenging. He raised this with Charlotte, in the library on a night in May. He told her the revenge felt hollow. He told her he did not understand why, when it was succeeding. He told her, and it was the most he had said about Lydia to anyone since she died, about his sister, and the destruction of her, and the vow in the cottage, and the architecture of the marriage he had built to fulfill it. He told her, "I married you to wound them. I've not pretended otherwise. You were a weapon." He looked at her across the library. He told her, "And it is succeeding, and it feels like ashes, and I do not understand why." Charlotte Reeve listened to the whole of it. She did not flinch at being told, plainly, that she had been a weapon, because she had known it from the first day and had never pretended otherwise to herself. She listened, and she thought, in the careful way she thought about everything, And then she told him the truth, because she had been ruined for telling the truth, and had decided long ago that she would rather be ruined for it than comfortable without it. She told him, "It feels like ashes because you have become them." He went still. She told him, "You despise the ton because it treats people as instruments, because it took your sister, who was a person, and used her and discarded her and felt nothing. And your revenge has been to take me, who am a person, and use me, and you have not discarded me yet, but you acquired me to be discarded, eventually, once I had served my purpose." She held his eyes. She told him, "The only difference between you and the society that destroyed Lydia is that you have told yourself your cruelty is justified. But the ton tells itself that too. Every cruel person who ever lived has told themselves their cruelty was justified. That is what cruelty is. It is the conviction that this particular person does not count, for this particular reason. And the reason is always sufficient to the person who holds it." She told him, "You did not avenge your sister. You honored the people who destroyed her by becoming one of them. You took the lesson they taught you, that some people are instruments and may be used, and you learned it perfectly, and you turned it on me." The Earl of Hawksmoor sat in his library and listened to his wife tell him that he had become the thing he hated, and he understood, with the specific, terrible clarity of a true thing arriving all at once, that she was right. He had spent 3 years believing he was Lydia's avenger. He had been, all along, her destroyer's best pupil. He told her, after a long silence, "How do I stop?" She told him, "You cannot avenge a warm person by being cold. You can only honor them by being warm. Your sister was generous and trusting and kind, and the way to answer what was done to her is not to become vicious in her name. It is to be, in a vicious world, the thing she was. To refuse the lesson they taught you, to treat people as people, especially the ones the world has decided do not count." She looked at him. She told him, "That is the only revenge that is not also a defeat. Everything else is just the ton, wearing your face." He changed slowly, because real changes are slow, and the change began with her. He stopped treating her as a weapon. This was not a dramatic renunciation. It was a series of small adjustments over the weeks of early summer, in which the Earl of Hawksmoor began to treat his wife as what she was, rather than what he had acquired her to be, began to consult her, to defer to her judgment where her judgment was better than his, which was often, to arrange his household and his affairs as though she were a partner rather than an instrument. He gave her control of things. He gave her, without quite announcing it, the position of a countess in fact, rather than merely in title. A person with authority and opinions that mattered, rather than a sword to be wielded and sheathed. And he found, in treating her as a person, that the hollowness began to recede. Not because the revenge was working better, but because he had stopped trying to avenge Lydia by becoming her enemies, and had begun instead to honor her by becoming, slowly, awkwardly, against 3 years of cold habit, something more like the warm person she had been. The test came in July, at the Pemberton garden party, and it was the inverse of the Aldermere ball. At the Pemberton party, a story began to circulate. The old story, the true story of Charlotte's ruin, which someone had unearthed and was spreading in the careful, deniable way the ton spread such things. The story of the Governess and the Baronet's son. But the version circulating was the Baronet's family's version. The lie, the version in which Charlotte had been the brazen one, the grasping one, the one who had pursued and been justly dismissed. It was spreading through the garden party with the specific relish the ton brought to confirming that a woman it had been forced to receive was, after all, exactly the ruined creature it had always known her to be. The Earl heard it. He heard it from a cluster near the roses, heard his wife's name and the lie attached to it, heard the smiling cruelty assembling itself to wound her, to take the truth she had told at the Aldermere ball and bury it under the convenient falsehood. And he understood, in the hearing, that he had a choice. The kind of choice that he had spent 3 years believing he was incapable of. The kind of choice that revealed what a man actually was. He could let it pass. The story did not threaten him. It threatened Charlotte. And a man who saw his wife as a weapon would have let a weapon take a scratch without troubling himself. Letting it pass would cost him nothing. Defending her would cost him a great deal, because defending her meant defending the truth of her ruin, which meant taking on the baronet's family, which meant a public quarrel that the cold, self-contained Earl of Hawksmoor would once have considered far beneath his dignity. He chose to defend her. He crossed the garden to the cluster by the roses, and he did the thing that announced, to the whole of the Pemberton party, that the Earl of Hawksmoor's marriage was no longer what London had assumed it to be. He told the cluster, coldly, precisely, with the full weight of his rank and his reputation behind every word, that he had heard the story they were so enjoying, and that he wished to correct it, because it was a lie, and he did not care to have lies told about his wife. He told them the truth, the whole of it. What the baronet's son had actually done, how Charlotte had refused him, how she had been ruined, not for grasping, but for refusing to grasp, for declining to be used, and then declining to lie about why. He told them that his wife had been ruined for the single offence of having more honour than the gentleman who pursued her, and that he found it characteristic of the ton that it had punished her for it, and characteristic of the ton that it was now, at a garden party, repeating the lie that a guilty family had invented to protect a guilty son. He told them, "I married my wife, originally, for reasons that do me no credit, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I have had the privilege, these months, of coming to know her, and I will tell you what I have learned. She is the most honest person I have ever met, and she was ruined for it, and any one of you who repeats the lie that ruined her may consider that you do so in direct contradiction of the Earl of Hawksmoor, who knows the truth, and who is telling it to you now." It was the protection of her reputation over his own pride, the public choice that signalled to everyone present that the cold Earl who had married a weapon had become a man who would stand, publicly and at cost, between his wife and the cruelty of the world. The story stopped circulating. The truth, told by an Earl, was a great deal harder to bury than the truth told by a ruined governess. And Charlotte Reeve, who had been standing across the garden, who had heard the whole of it, looked at her husband across the Pemberton roses with an expression he had not seen on her before, the cold amusement gone, replaced by something that the Earl, in his 3 years of cold purpose, had nearly forgotten how to recognize, and which he recognized now, with a jolt that went through the whole of him. She was looking at him the way Lydia used to look at him before, as though he were a person worth caring about. He confessed it that night in the library, because he had learned from her that the truth was the only thing worth speaking, and that speaking it, however it cost, was better than the comfortable silence. He told her that his heart was no longer under his own control. He told her, clumsily, because he had no practice at it, because 3 years of cold purpose had left him without the language for warmth, and he had to find the words as he went, that he had married her as a weapon, and had spent these months discovering that he had married, instead, the only person in the world who saw him clearly and did not flinch from what she saw. That she had taken his cynicism apart, not by softening it, but by being sharper than it. That she had shown him he had become his enemies and had shown him how to stop. And that the stopping had given him back something he had thought died in the cottage with Lydia, which was the capacity to feel anything other than cold. He told her, "I do not know how to do this. I have not, since my sister, I have not let myself care for anyone, because caring is how they destroy you. They took Lydia because I loved her and they knew it. I built the coldness to make myself unassailable, and you have walked through it as though it were nothing, and I find that I do not want it back. I find that I would rather be assailable with you than safe without you." He told her, "I married you to spite the ton, and I have lost my heart to you entirely, and I do not want it back. And I am telling you this without the slightest idea whether you can possibly feel anything for a man who acquired you as an instrument. But I have learned, from you, that the truth must be spoken, regardless of what it costs. And so I am speaking it. I love you. I have no right to, given how this began, but I do." Charlotte Reeve looked at her husband across the library. She had been ruined by men who saw her as an instrument. She had married a man who saw her as a weapon. She had spent these months, she realized, waiting, without quite admitting it to herself, to discover whether the Earl of Hawksmoor would turn out to be one more man who used her, or whether he would turn out to be something rarer. He had turned out to be something rarer. She had watched it happen, watched him take the mirror she held up and actually look into it, watched him face the thing he had become and choose to stop, watched him stand in a garden and defend her truth over his own pride. She had watched a cold man become a warm one, slowly and at real cost, and she had found, somewhere in the watching, that the cold amusement she had brought to the marriage had become something else entirely. She told him, "You acquired me as an instrument. That is true, and I will not pretend it is not. But you are the first man who, having acquired me so, troubled to discover that I was a person, and then changed because of it." The baronet's son saw an instrument and used it. The ton saw an instrument and discarded it. You saw an instrument, and you let me become, in your eyes, a person. And then you let the person change you. She looked at him. She told him, "That is the only thing any of them never did. And it is, it turns out, the thing that matters." She told him, "I did not expect to love you. I expected to use the marriage as you used it, a sword handed to a ruined woman, a way to walk back into the drawing rooms that cast me out and make them curtsy. I did not expect the man who handed me the sword to turn out to be worth more than the revenge." She crossed the library to him. She told him, "You asked me once whether you knew the color of your wife's eyes. You did not that day. You had not looked." She stood before him. She told him, "Look now." He looked. Grey. Clear and direct and grey, and looking at him, not with cold amusement, but with the thing he had recognized across the Pemberton roses, the warmth, the regard, the look of a person who has decided that another person is worth caring about. He told her, "I should have looked the first day." She told him, "No, you were not ready the first day. You were still their pupil." She put her hand against his cheek. The first time she had touched him, in all the months of the marriage, by her own choice, rather than the forms. She told him, "You are not their pupil anymore. You looked at me and saw a person, and it cost you your coldness, and you let it. That is the whole of it, Adrian. That is everything. The world is full of people who see instruments. You are the rare one who looked again and saw a person, and let the seeing change you. The Earl of Hawksmoor, Adrian, took his wife's hand from his cheek and held it, in the library, in the warm lamplight, and the wall he had built in a cold cottage 3 years before came down entirely. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in the quiet way that walls come down when the thing they were built to keep out turns out to be the thing you most need to let in. He told her, "I set out to ruin the Tun, and I seem to have found the only person in England who understands me." She told him, "That is rather a poor return on a campaign of revenge." He told her, "It is the best return I have ever received on anything." He looked at her. He told her, "I would burn the whole revenge to the ground for it, and count myself ahead." She told him, "There is no need to burn it." She smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her grey-eyed composure into something he would spend the rest of his life trying to earn again. She told him, "We will simply do the thing that horrifies them most of all, which they will never recover from and never forgive." He asked her what that was. She told him, "We will be happy, openly, obviously, unmistakably happy." The cold Earl and the ruined Governess, who married for spite and found a love the entire Tun will spend the rest of its life unable to explain and unable to match. She told him, "There is no revenge in the world like a vicious society being forced to watch two people it tried to destroy be happier than it will ever be. It is the one thing they cannot do to us, and cannot take from us, and cannot bear to see." The Earl of Hawksmoor looked at his wife and understood that he had, after all, finally found the revenge that was not also a defeat. It was happiness. It had been happiness all along. They were happy. That was the whole of it in the end, and it was the most complete revenge either of them could have devised. Though neither of them, after a while, thought of it as revenge at all. The Tun never understood it. It had a great capacity for understanding cruelty and ambition and the cold transactions of advantage, because those were the materials it was built from. But it had almost no capacity for understanding two people who had been handed every reason for bitterness and had chosen, instead, each other. The marriage that London had expected to be a scandal and then a cautionary tale became, instead, the one marriage in the Tun that everyone privately envied and no one could account for. The cold Earl who had thawed, the ruined Governess who had turned out to be the cleverest woman in 3 counties. The two of them building, in the great cold house that Charlotte slowly made warm, a partnership of equals that made every advantageous, loveless, correct marriage in Mayfair look like exactly what it was. Charlotte became, in time, a power in her own right. Not the kind of power the Tun recognized, which was the power of birth and connection, but the kind it could not ignore, which was the power of a sharp mind and a sharp tongue, and a complete fearlessness born of having already survived the world could do. She was received everywhere, eventually, not because the Tun forgave her, but because it could not afford to exclude a woman whose wit it feared, and whose husband it could not cross. And she used her position the way she did everything, with a clear eye for the people the world had decided did not count, and a particular protectiveness toward the governesses and the ruined women, and the people handed the lessons she had been handed, for whom the Countess of Hawksmoor became, quietly, a formidable and unexpected ally. Adrian became warm, not to the Tun. He never warmed to the Tun, and neither did she, and they shared all their lives a clear-eyed and entirely justified contempt for the smiling cruelty that had destroyed his sister and ruined his wife. But to her, and to the household, and eventually to the children, he became the warm man that the cottage and the coldness had nearly buried forever. The man Lydia would have recognized, the brother she had loved, brought back from the cold purpose that had almost replaced him entirely. He told Charlotte once, years into the marriage, that she had given him back his sister. She told him she had done no such thing, that Lydia was gone, and nothing could give her back, and that pretending otherwise was a sentiment unworthy of him. He told her, "I do not mean Lydia herself. I mean the part of me that loved her, the warm part, the part the ton nearly killed when it killed her, that I buried under the coldness because the coldness felt safer. You dug it back up. You showed me that becoming cold did not avenge her. It only finished what they started. And you showed me how to be warm again in a world that punishes warmth, which is the only thing that honors her at all." She told him, "I did not show you. You chose it. I held up a mirror. You looked. Most people do not look." She put her hand on his. She told him, "That is the whole of what you are, Adrian, and it is the rarest thing in the world. A man who looked into the mirror and did not turn away." And perhaps that is why this story will not let us go. Not because an earl married a governess to spite the ton, or because a vicious society was confounded, or because two people the world tried to destroy ended happy, but because of the mirror. A cold man set out to avenge his sister, and built his revenge so carefully, and was so certain of his own righteousness, and never once suspected that in becoming cold, he had become the very thing he hated. That the lesson the ton had taught him, some people are instruments, and may be used, was a lesson he had learned perfectly, and was now teaching to a woman he had acquired as a weapon. And the woman he acquired refused to be a weapon. She refused it the way she had refused everything the world tried to make her be. By being, persistently and undeniably, a person. And being a person, she did the thing no instrument can do. She held up a mirror and showed him what he had become, and told him the truth he had been ruined for telling, which was that you cannot avenge a warm soul by becoming a cold one, that you can only honor the people the world destroys by refusing, in a destroying world, to become a destroyer. He looked into the mirror. That was the whole of it. He looked, and he did not turn away, and he chose, slowly, at cost, against 3 years of cold habit, to become warm again, in a world that punishes warmth, because the warmth was the only thing that honored his sister, and the coldness only finished what her killers began. That is what love did in this story. It was not soft. It did not rescue him with tenderness. It held up a hard mirror and made him look, and the looking cost him everything he had built to keep himself safe. And he paid it, because the woman holding the mirror was worth more than the safety. He married her to spite the ton. He lost his heart to the one person who refused to let him become the ton. And the two of them, who had been handed every reason for bitterness, chose instead to be happy, which was, in the end, the only revenge that did not also make them into their enemies, and the only one worth having. Subscribe to Moonlight at Mayfair